You're listening to EduVoices, Champion Foster Futures, a podcast amplifying the voices of those transforming education for children in foster care. Each episode brings you real stories, research, and advocacy efforts to improve the lives of foster youth. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Now, let's dive in.
Welcome to EduVoices, Championing Foster Futures. I'm Stephanie Barbre, and alongside me is my co-host, Dusty Palmer.
Today's conversation focuses on one of the most important and often misunderstood intersections in education, foster care, and special education. Research consistently shows that students in foster care experience significantly higher rates of school mobility, academic disruption, and special education identification than their peers. Frequent school transitions can interrupt services and create challenges in maintaining educational continuity.
At the same time, many foster-connected students have experienced trauma, making it critical for educators and caregivers to understand the difference between trauma responses, learning differences, and disability-related needs. Effective advocacy can make all the difference in ensuring students receive appropriate supports and services.
To help us navigate these issues, we're joined by Dr. Bridgett Dolan of Spero Advocacy Consulting. Today, we'll discuss special education advocacy, IEPs, ARD meetings, trauma-informed supports, and practical strategies for helping foster youth succeed. Dr. Dolan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you share the story of Spero Advocacy Consulting and what led you into special education advocacy work?
It's kind of unique how that happened. And I feel like starting off in my career, things happened that really set a passion in my heart for special education. So right out of college, my first teaching job, I taught in San Bernardino City School District, which is a really rough city within California. We're talking high poverty rates, high incarceration rates, gangs. And so the students that I dealt with were already, high needs by nature. And I remember referring students for special education and being told things around, let's not move that fast yet. It's probably just because of their home. I remember being told they've probably never had a book read to them, things like that. And then moving here into Texas, I was at a job teaching, and there was this one child that had some what I recognized as concerns. And so I referred him for special education assessment. Of course, the admin at the time wanted to RTI or MTSS him. We waited about 6 weeks, and at the end of those 6 weeks, I sat down with one of the admins, the testing coordinator, the intervention specialist, and myself. And they explained to tell me that this student is making progress. And because he's making progress, we don't see a need to test for special education. Well, he was in MTSS and receiving a tremendous amount of support from me in research-based instruction. So of course he was going to make progress. And so the admin at the time had told me the vote is 3-1, Bridgett, he's not getting tested. That didn't sit well with me. I went home, I researched child find, and throughout this process, while this was happening concurrently, I was also enrolled in the doctoral program at Tech, and I was taking an education law policy class, and that's when I started to realize, oh, no wonder why this doesn't sit right with me. It's illegal. And so that kind of really spurred a passion in me. I really started to question things. And then moving to California, I became kind of an IEP compliance coordinator for a nationwide chain of NPS schools. So that's non-public schools. And a lot of the students that we serviced were in foster care and students part of the juvenile justice system. And so in reviewing their IEPs, this is the case that really solidified like the direction that I wanted to do with my life and my career. There was this young man, he was a senior in high school. He was living in a group home and he had no criminal record at the time. In reviewing his IEP, I could see that numerous goals were like copy and pasted from years over. He didn't make growth benchmarks and objectives were limited, very vague goals. And so, in looking at that, I kind of realized like, wow, he was identified in second grade. What if somebody took the time to develop him as a person and do what he was entitled to legally? The complete trajectory of his life could have been changed. Instead, this child is now entering society at a third grade reading level, a second grade math level. Now he's in an NPS school surrounded by students in the juvenile justice system. He actually ended up doing drugs with another student on campus, and that was the start of his criminal record. So seeing that was really heartbreaking for me. Like talking about it, I still kind of get goosebumps because as an educator, we had an obligation and the public school system failed him.
So you kind of touched on this quite a bit already, but aside from the special ed piece of it and trying to get the student from MTSS to a referral, what gaps in the educational system do you observe that made you feel like this work was necessary?
Oh, there's really so many gaps, but I can identify a couple. So one of the biggest gaps I see is when goals, or this term that's appropriately ambitious, right? So when you're writing goals for IEPs, they need to be appropriately ambitious. And that term, I feel like a lot of schools, admins, everybody part of the IEP team really glosses over that. And that's kind of, a gap because if you write goals that are too easy and the student aces them, then what is he left to work on the rest of the year? He should continuously be working on it to enable 1 year of growth. And then also it should be based upon their greatest area of need. So if it's a complete weakness of a student, then we should be writing a fairly difficult goal that they can still achieve, but is the most significant to them. And that's one area, one gap that I see really often in when I'm reviewing goals. Another example is, I think probably meaningful parental participation. IDEA makes it very clear that schools, the burden is placed on schools. They have that obligation to ensure meaningful participation. And what that means is a parent is an equal part of the IEP team. And too often, you see parents receive their procedural safeguards in an email or as a handout, and then they're simply asked, "Do you have any questions?" And they take that as the participation. And in my advocacy work, I deal with parents that they don't know the same terminology. You walk into this meeting, I have been in meetings where everyone has their computer and everybody's got a draft and the parent is sitting there not looking at anything and just listening. Like, how can you tell me that's equal and meaningful participation? Print out your draft, give it to them, explain what the acronyms are, all of those things. So there's a lot of gaps there that need to continue to be addressed.
Thank you for sharing that. Research by Geenan and Powers and later work by Zetling and colleagues suggests that foster youth often face both higher rates of special education identification and disruptions in services due to school mobility. From your experience, what are the most common special education challenges faced by students in foster care?
I think that once a student changes, districts, schools, you have your 30-day review to do. So that means, you have you have a new student, you of course adopt that IEP immediately, but you have 30 days to review it with the IEP team. And what I've seen consistently is really schools just using this as a formality, a compliance piece to just check off the box. Yes, we've had the review meeting. But it's an opportunity, especially with our foster youth, to consider, are the present levels still accurate? Are these goals still needed? So, for example, when I'm working with a case, I always try to obtain as much information as possible within those 30 days. Classroom observations, parent and teacher input, baseline assessments to really disaggregate that information and hold it up to the present levels to determine if these still are the areas of need. And that's where I feel the students, especially our foster youth with high, mobility rates, the services are getting dropped off, they're getting forgotten or left out completely.
So, in that case, how can schools ensure that foster youth with IEPs don't fall through the cracks during those school transitions?
Do their jobs. Yes. When we say it's a 30-day IEP review, that means reviewing it, sitting down and taking the time to really understand the student's needs. That's really, what it takes. I don't know why schools continue to do what they've always done, but something definitely needs to change. Coming in as an IEP compliance coordinator, I was able to bring these issues up within my organization so that we can address them. But in the public school system, I'm wondering who has eyes on that, especially when it's a foster child that's coming from, multiple schools. Do we have their full, complete background? What trauma have they, experienced that could be, you know, also parallel with these disabilities? Things like that, as well as what are their strengths? What are the areas that they thrive in and how can we leverage that? So really just taking that time during that 30-day IEP review time to review every component and really understanding what is in the IEP and how it's supposed to be made up to really support the student.
Let's get into understanding the IEPs and ARD meetings, alphabet soup, right? Individualized education plans, admission, review, and dismissal meetings. What are some of the most misconceptions families and caregivers have about special education services?
Let's see. So some of the misconceptions families and caregivers have. So this one definitely I would say is that students have to be failing in order to qualify for special education. That is completely inaccurate. And I've actually been in district meetings where I've heard school psychologists say that to parents. And that's really alarming because, number one, the person that is issuing those assessments doesn't understand their position or the law. And so when you have issues like that, that's an immediate red flag for me, right? The law states that students should be able to access their education, right? And so when we think of education, I feel like people within the school commonly just think of academics, but it's not. It's so much more. It's social communication, it's behavior, it's self-regulation, it's executive functioning. It's all of those things. It's how you spend time on the recess. How long can you maintain eye contact? Can you ask more than two questions and having a conversation? Can you wait your turn? Everything is part of your education, not just academics. And so it's really eye-opening when I have parents come to me and I can reassure them that what they're seeing is an issue and that we can do something about it.
So, when reviewing an IEP, what are some other red flags that may indicate that a plan is not fully meeting the student's needs?
So, in the past, when I've reviewed IEPs, I'm going to speak about a particular student. He was identified at a fairly young age with having ADHD. And common ADHD behaviors for a boy his age, being unable to sit still, fidgets a lot, blurting out, things like that. But as he started to get older, he started to be disciplined at a higher rate than his peers, often for things that and it was in less structured environments where there were a lot of peers around. And so he was disciplined for the words that he was saying, when in reality, it was a deficit in his communication and his, so receptive, expressive, and pragmatics. And so the family had brought me in because now the school had labeled him with racist remarks and terrorist threats, which are going to affect him for college applications. And so when I came in, some red flags for the IEP that stood out to me was, number one, he was identified as autistic by the family, by parents and the family, right? Or yeah, within the family. And so with that knowledge, the schools under Child Find, like, they have an obligation to seek and find and assess. They address the ADHD and continue to discipline for things, but when schools recognize a pattern of behavior and it's consistently progressing, they have an obligation then to come back to the team and ask those questions why. Had they done that, they would have realized, oh, he received a diagnosis of autism a year and a half ago. We also exited him from speech 3 years ago. So these were all red flags to me. He was exited speech because he met his articulation goals. He still showed an area of need in communication, but there was no goal that was made or addressed or implemented. So if that student had received receptive, expressive, pragmatic language, specially designed instruction, who knows? He may not have ever had those discipline remarks. So really taking a look at the IEP to make sure that it really does represent the student. Especially when behavior impacts learning, I often see present levels describe that it impacts learning, but the box that says behavior impedes learning of self or others is not checked. And it should be. We should be developing a behavior intervention plan. If that box is checked, we should be issuing an FBA to inform the creation of the BIP. But shortcuts are often taken. When that box is checked, I see BIPs that are created that serve no purpose, and then they become useless. So just really making sure that everything in the IEP really speaks to the student and understanding the framework of, the laws and how it's supposed to work together. I'm able to identify a few of those red flags.
With hearing all these red flags and thinking about the comment you made on when the parent comes in, some parents, they come in and you're right, they don't have the materials in front of them and it's almost, here, sign this so we can get out of here, right? Just agree. So how can foster parents, volunteers, caregivers, CASA volunteers, SSCC, social workers effectively prepare for these ARD meetings when they may not know anything about special education?
Yeah, there's a lot of Facebook groups out there run by parents. And I think that's if you have a student on a 504 IEP or anything like that, it's really great to get in contact with other parents and kind of just bounce off your ideas. I'm a part of these groups and I know I offer comprehensive IEP reviews or meeting strategies complimentary. And I know a lot of other advocates do too, because the goal is, at the end of the day, to educate as many parents so that they could advocate for their own kids. And that means understanding how, your evaluations, your FIE determines eligibility, how your present levels dictate needs, needs determine goals, and goals determine services and supports. And that is, I think, one of the greatest areas that parents can understand, as well as their procedural safeguards. And knowing that you are an equal and meaningful part of the IEP team and that your input must be considered. Yeah, I always recommend to parents, before you go into a meeting, you ask for those copies. It's really like walking in blind and almost setting the meeting up for failure if you don't have a copy of it. You should be able to read it over and make sure that you have concerns that are stated in there, as well as always asking to record. Some states are two-party consent, some are one-party consent states. So I always have my clients ask to record the meeting at least 48 hours in advance. That way, at the end of the meeting, you're able to review the notes and ensure that everything was documented accurately.
And I think recording gets a bad rap, right? Because it's rarely about, trying to get somebody. We should encourage parents to do that, right? Because they might have questions well after that ORD meeting, but they didn't think to ask, right? And so I think it could be a very useful tool. And I appreciate that, you tell them, ask permission in advance because they really don't have to, right? But it is courtesy, and the school may want to record on their end as well for whatever reason. But I'm glad that you said that because I think it can be a very useful tool for parents. And even just to sit back, or if the other parent's not able to attend, it might be for that other parent's sake. It's never, I don't think it should ever be a negative thing, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, if it's your right, it should never be something negative, and parents have a right to ask to record.
Absolutely. If you're finding value in today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe to EduVoices, championing foster futures on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribing ensures you never miss an episode packed with powerful stories, expert insights, and actionable strategies for supporting children in foster care. Plus, it helps us continue growing this community of educators, advocates, and changemakers. Now let's get back to the conversation. So researchers such as Diane Bruskus and Michael Perfect have highlighted how trauma can influence the way students learn, behave, and engage in school. For foster-connected youth, that can make it especially challenging for educators to distinguish between a trauma response and a disability-related need. So how does trauma intersect with special education identification and service delivery?
Well, I feel like a lot of times learning disabilities can be mistaken for trauma responses, and trauma responses can be mistaken for learning disabilities. So first of all, it's so important that educators now more than ever have an informed knowledge of trauma-based education, what is trauma, how to deal with students that have experienced trauma, all of these things. A student that is constantly spending their life in high stress environments, like we already know that impacts the way your brain works, your memory, how you respond, all of that, and then we sit them down and we expect them to, stay seated and learn for 7 hours straight when this child may be in a fight or flight state of mind, constantly on edge, waiting just for the next thing to push them over. So I think it's really important that educators, first of all, have that trauma-informed knowledge to really determine how to handle these students, In working at the NPS school, I remember a situation with a young girl, and I had asked her to move seats because she was talking or whatever. It wasn't working out. I had asked her to move seats and she wouldn't. And at that point, she's heated. I was heated. I was really upset. I ended up walking away. And the rest of the days that followed, she was really, upset. And we're talking, these are kids within the juvenile justice system. So, she's got the FUs and calling me the B word every chance she gets and stuff. And I kind of took a step back and realized, like, okay, this relationship needs to be repaired. So I approached her, apologized for telling her to move. I should have asked her, and we were able to move forward in that relationship. She actually broke down crying and was like, "No one's ever apologized to me before." So it's those responses right there. Did she have an ED or behavioral disorder, or was that her trauma fight or flight response kicking in due to the nature that she's been raised in?
Well, that's very powerful for you to do that and come back, and for someone that's never been apologized to,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Let's take this a little deeper. How can educators better differentiate between trauma responses and learning disabilities when making instructional or referral decisions?
Well, differentiating between trauma responses and learning disabilities is one of the most important and challenging tasks that educators face. I think, research shows that trauma and disability can present with remarkably similar characteristics. So, one useful framework is Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential mode of therapeutics, which explains how trauma affects brain development. And, I briefly touched on how trauma can activate the brain stress response, leaving the students in the constant state of fight or flight. So, as a result, the trauma affected students may appear inattentive, impulsive, oppositional, academically delayed, or even when they don't have that learning disability. But in contrast, the SLD, the specific learning disabilities, are generally characterized by persistent deficits in specific areas of academic functioning, despite appropriate instruction and intervention. So, research based on the patterns of strengths and weakness model and contemporary theories really suggests that students with learning disabilities demonstrate these consistent deficits and underlying cognitive processes. So, that includes things like phonological processing, working memory, processing speed. And these deficits tend to remain stable across settings where, with trauma responses, those may differ depending on the environment that the student is in.
So then, if a foster parent suspects a child may need a special education evaluation, what should be their first step?
The first step is always to put your request in writing and making it a formal and documented request. It's important to know your state's timeline for this request. I know in many states it's 15 days, and so you want your response, either your assessment plan or your PWN, stating their refusal and all 7 legal stipulations why. If that PWN, which is prior written notice, doesn't entail all 7 legal elements, then, you can further dispute their reasons. So it's important you document that request. If a foster parent suspects that a child may need special education services, they should begin to communicate to the school, and then also remind the school that they have an affirmative obligation to identify, locate, and evaluate students. So oftentimes by the time a foster care parent notices these deficits and reports it to the school should have already taken that affirmative action and locating, identifying, and referring. Furthermore, they can start to create, a paper trail, any emails going back and forth, collection of work, things like that. Are you helping them with homework? How many times do you have to prompt them? Are you pointing to remind them? Are you using a verbal prompt? Do you use a timer? Things like that are all really helpful information when you are requesting support for your student.
Is there any other documentation that caregivers, advocates, or foster parents should always keep organized when supporting a student?
Yes. It's important to keep everything organized because you never know when a dispute may arise. And it's not uncommon that, once a parent gets active in advocating for their child, that they fall down a rabbit's hole of mistakes that they've found. And pretty soon, we've got state complaints and due process filings happen. And that's when it's really important to take a look at the documentation that you have. So one of the most important things would be like a well-organized educational file for their child that has at minimum copies of all of the IEPs, any revisions, 504 plans, evaluation reports, multidisciplinary reports, eligibility determinations, progress reports, report cards, behavior plans, PWNs. You always want to save those. So these documents really create a timeline of what services were offered, what decisions were made, and whether the student is making meaningful progress. So caregivers should also save all communications with the school and really just document, their efforts in advocating for their child.
So then how can school leaders create a more transparent and supportive systems for vulnerable learners?
I think the mentality of us versus them has to completely change. A lot of times I walk into meetings and the shift in the air is so tense, and I always start off by telling them, like, I'm here to work with you, not against you. And that mentality needs to completely change. When a parent is advocating for their child, they're not working against you. They're working with you to show you your error so that you can correct it. And that starts with creating a transparent and supportive system for all learners. And that means, including students with disability, foster youth, students experiencing homelessness, multilingual learners, students impacted by trauma. One of the most important ways I think leaders can create transparency is through proactive communication. Families should never be surprised by concerns that arise at an IEP meeting, a disciplinary hearing, parent conferences, changes to the IEP with either accommodations added or taken away, anything like that. Parents who understand what is happening and why these decisions are being made are more likely to be collaborative partners in the education process than someone that you have to work against. So I think that strong leaders create systems where the data drives decisions, whether discussing reading interventions, behavioral supports, or eligibility. They're able to clearly explain what data was collected and why they can rely on this data for their decisions. And that transparency means making it accessible and understandable to families rather than treating it as information that only the professionals have the privy to look at.
I always think of the phrase, what's not documented doesn't count.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very true.
Yeah. Educational outcomes improve when schools, families, advocates, and service providers work collaboratively. In your view, what systematic changes are needed to improve outcomes for foster youth receiving special education services?
There's so many changes that need to occur deep within the organizations to really have change. Being a part of the public school system, I realized I couldn't make the type of change that I wanted to within. But if we want to see the type of change that IDEA was built for, then the change does have to come from within. So if we truly want to improve outcomes for foster youth, the first systemic change must be to return to the original purpose of IDEA. And I think that's providing an individualized education based on the unique needs of each child. We forget that individualized part when creating and implementing IEPs. These education decisions should be driven by what the student needs and not by what's available or convenient or cost effective for the school system. It really needs to be focused on what's necessary for the student to receive their free and appropriate public education. So, special education was never intended to be a one-size-fits-all. It was designed to provide specialized instruction and supports tailored to the individual needs of the student. And so, for foster youth who frequently experience educational disruptions and unmet needs, individualized planning is even more critical. And so I think a shift needs to happen both in the mindset of transparency, of individualized education, and ultimately really reducing the burden placed on families and caregivers to secure the services that the students are already legally entitled to receive. When I'm hired, it's my job to argue and show why we want a specific service. And I will only make that argument if it's held up legally. And so if it's legal, then that student always had a right to it. Why is that burden placed on the family to investigate, to research, to now find and pay somebody to do this for them when it's the school's federal and legal obligation?
Sounds like schools need to do it with fidelity and not just worry about the compliance piece.
Absolutely. I always think of it as kind of like this analogy of you sit down to a restaurant, right? And the way schools kind of think about it is no substitutions. Here's our menu and no substitutions, no matter what it is, right? I'm gluten intolerant or whatever, no substitutions. This is it. And so I think of it as a school like, oh, I have a reading disability. I'm dyslexic. Well, here's your menu of choices. Pick which one fits you best. And that's not really how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be individualized. What does the data show us how the student learns? And how do we create a plan to implement that?
What message would you most like educators, school leaders, and policymakers to hear regarding foster youth and special education?
To remember why special education exists. So, first and foremost, the purpose of special education is not to fit students into existing programs, budget, staffing models, or systems of convenience, but the purpose is to provide, again, those individualized supports and specialized instruction that really allow each child to access and benefit from their education. So we need to really stop asking, what services do we have available, and really start asking, what does this student need? I'd also really want to challenge policymakers and educational leaders to recognize that families should not have to become legal experts, hire advocates, retain attorneys, file complaints, threaten due process simply to obtain the services that their child is entitled to under federal law. So when families are forced to fight for these things, the system isn't functioning as intended. That's not what IDEA was created or intended for. And the families who are the most vulnerable, including those foster families and families facing economic hardship, are often the least equipped to navigate these barriers, which means the students who need the most support don't have access to it.
As we wrap up, and thank you for providing your insight today, where can our listeners learn more about Spero Advocacy and Consulting and the resources you provide?
Yeah, so anyone can follow me on Instagram. I'm Spero_sped, as well as my website, speroed.com. That's SPEROED.com. We're also on TikTok as Spero Sped and Facebook for Spero Advocacy and Consulting. I just wanted to point out that the name of my company, Spero, is Latin for to hope. And so that was originally created to give families and students hope for their education and their future. So come check us out.
I love that. I love the background about that. Well, Dr. Dolan, thank you for sharing your expertise and your commitment to advocating for students and families. Today's conversation reminds us that protecting educational rights requires more than just compliance. It requires collaboration, communication, and a commitment to ensuring every child has access to the support they need to thrive. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of EduVoices, Championing Foster Futures. If you found today's discussion valuable, please subscribe, share this episode with fellow educators, CASA advocates, foster parents, and community partners, and visit championingfosterfutures.com for additional episodes and resources. Together, we can continue creating stronger educational pathways and brighter futures for foster-connected youth.
Thank you for joining us on EduVoices, Champion Foster Futures. We hope today's episode sparked new insights and deepened your commitment to supporting foster youth. For updates, bonus content, and upcoming sessions, follow us on our social media outlets or visit our podcast page. But until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep advocating.